Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. The TPE Carousel, around and around we go. Absolutely, Brian, around and around we go. I don't know which number of podcasts this is on TPE, but it doesn't stop. And now there's been some new developments, so we wanted to share what we're seeing from the field. So why don't you kick us off, Brian? What's the latest and greatest?
Yeah, well, we've been dealing with TPEs for years. We've seen them focus on different subject matters, and there's a few new flavors of TPE out there that have come up recently. One of them is, it identifies itself in the letter as a Bene sharing or beneficiary sharing focus, which is intended, it appears, to look at patients who have gone from home health to hospice, sometimes where those home health and hospice providers have common ownership or control, and other times when they do not. So perhaps they're looking at, is there something about that relationship that causes them to question the eligibility of patients? Like if they're being referred from the left hand to the right hand of the same organization, is there some reason to be suspicious of the eligibility or documentation of those patients? That may be what they're going after. So we've seen a few of those.
But the bennies are not on hospice and home health at the same time. It's
correct.
Just the referral happened. So yeah, and I feel like that's a recycled issue from, how many years ago. I feel like that was coming up, but we haven't seen that for a long time. But yeah, especially weird when you don't have a home health. Mm-hmm. You're the hospice, and
and now the home health, there's been TPEs in the home health area that have dealt with beneficiary sharing as well. So this could be just them trying to get the other half of the picture. Maybe the focus is really on the home health side, and they're just rounding out the story by going after hospices on these kinds of TPEs, because these have been relatively limited as compared with the other kinds of TPEs that have been directed at hospices. But it's kind of something new on the horizon. That's what they're looking at. It doesn't, in our view, doesn't really change the strategy for responding very much. You still want to, get medical records in and, do some advocacy as you can to try to get out of this TPE early on. But it is something new that, the government is looking into, and therefore we should be mindful of it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that the other one that really cranks me up is, which I don't recall ever seeing in all of my years of practice, is these post-payment TPEs, which are, I think, troubling to me because there's such a long line of post-payment audits going on, whether you have the RAC or the UPIC or the SMRC. These CPI audits. I mean, there's just layers upon layers of post-payment review going on. Why the MACs need to do post-payment TPE is beyond me, and really isn't, I feel like, in the tenor of sort of what we're supposed to be doing, like education, real-time education, getting feedback, all this stuff. But
yeah, the TPEs, they move kind of quickly. Once you're in a round, you'll get your ADR for some records, and then within a relatively short amount of time, you'll see remittance advices pop up that address the decision, that provide the decision on the claim. And then at least early on in that patient's claim history or relative to the claim at issue, whether the MAC sees a problem with it. And then, there's the opportunity for real-time corrective action, maybe not to save that particular claim, but to save the next one or the next one as things go forward. But yeah, with post-payment, where they would have to go back a bit longer than the more recent claims, what can you do with that? You've already submitted the claim, you've already gotten paid, and maybe there's subsequent claims that are out there. So yeah, as far as TPE being geared toward the MACs educating hospices so they can take corrective action and then kind of review the effect of the education and making sure hospices are improving themselves, the post-pay aspect of this really doesn't foster that kind of reaction from hospices.
So those are, I guess, a couple of the new things that we've been seeing. I think we're still having people experience going to round 2 or round 3. And this is where I think you shouldn't just sit on your hands and just say, okay, I guess I'm moving to round 2 or 3. I mean, it's like looking at, has your error rate gone down significantly? Was your initial error rate really driven by technical issues that have been resolved? And therefore, you can advocate to not have a full 40 picked in round 2, like if things look good, getting off of that, because the guidance does talk about this should be an efficient use of resources. And what they're trying to get at is improved performance. So if you had an initially fairly high error rate and now you're around the target, right, error rate, is it really worth everyone's time and energy to audit you, especially if you win stuff on appeal too, well, not required to take that into account. I think that is oftentimes considered. So I think maybe that's something sometimes people are leaving on the table, of not knowing that there is advocacy that you can take in terms of, asking for it to not go to a round 2 based on some type of, like I just said, analysis of what your improvement has been, or making the round shorter. And we've been successful in some instances on that.
Yeah, I think you hit upon two of the areas that I think are worthwhile to raise with the MAC, and try to get some movement on them. And one is that when they're going, if you're in a round 2, well, what they should be doing, we believe, is pulling claims that follow the round 1 education session, because that's how they test whether that education session really took and the hospice improved. We've had some MACs in certain TPEs, they'll do the round 1 education and then they will pull a claim that follows that education, but it is affected by things that happened before the education session. And so you're like forever doomed to get denials because you can't go back in time. So trying to talk with the MAC about, making sure, let's have the round 2 requests relate to patients admitted after the round 1 education. That way you get the full impact of the education and the hospice's response to it. The other one is you mentioned appeals. I think it's a good idea to be prompt with your appeals. Try to get some of those initial denials overturned through the appeal process. So if you're successful with that in round 1, maybe before you go to round 2, you can go back to the MAC and say, hey, 2 or 3 or however many of the initial claim denials were reversed. You ought to readjust or recalculate our error rate. So maybe we're below the threshold, which is 15, 20, or 25%, depending upon your MAC, and try to get them to do it. As you said, Meg, this is kind of discretionary with the MACs. They're not required by regulations to accept this advocacy and agree with it, but it's kind of common sense stuff that we would hope the MACs eventually will see it makes sense and it's consistent with TPE to take those approaches.
Yeah, and so I think you're right, Brian. I mean, sitting on this for 120 days, I would not do that, even though you have 120 days to appeal this, because if you can get some of these overturned and move through the appeal process quickly, that can be, again, give you additional arguments to make about why you shouldn't have to move to an additional round, because sometimes it takes quite a while for the next round to start. So like sometimes there's backup on getting education lined up, and then whatever it is, 40 days, 45 days, or whatever it is that it would start after that. I mean, when you space that out, you could be fairly far into the appeal process if you don't sit on your hands and wait. So yeah, this is something that we generally say, try to quickly appeal your TPE and have an impact.
For one of our clients, that's exactly how it happened. It was, I think, a GIP TPE, and it just took a long time for the MAC to gather together 20 to 40 claims based upon that hospice's utilization. And so we were able to get ALJ decisions before round 2 would have started. And we were very successful at the ALJ stage. And the MAC took into account our wins at the ALJ stage in deciding to release them from the round 2, because they realized that initial error rate was incorrect, at least according to an ALJ. And thankfully, they took that reasonable approach. It's not going to happen every time, but that was heartening to see a MAC react that way.
Oh, definitely. And I have found that, the MACs are open to listening, and because these take a lot of resources on their end too. And I think they want to be, efficient in how they're using their internal resources. I think one frustrating part that maybe we can end with here is someone reached out earlier this week about being on a continuous care TPE, and they can't find the denial reason, right? And it's just very conclusory, not medically necessary. Well, even from the denial reason, you can't tell, but why? And they're just downcoding it to routine home care. So it's clearly not something with the units, right? Because if it was units, you just get a haircut on, the number of hours. But here it's downcoded to routine home care, and there's just not a lot of information. And so I think if we're going to call this an education process, education should be, I can understand from the decision what you think I'm doing that's incorrect, and not just wait to the education that might happen 5 months from now, because people really do want to take timely action. And I think that that's, in line with the purpose of this. And so I think it can be hard to get that more detailed information, because remittance advice is sometimes just use codes. And even if you go into DDE and look at that, we're finding that there's not much more detail in there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Those remits, they're heavy on codes, even codes that are supposed to alert people to appeal deadlines. Well, it's a code. You have to look up the code to figure out that it's actually an appeal alert. But also for the reason for the denial and the codes. I mean, there's a limited number of codes, so they're necessarily generally stated denials. You look up one code and it says something about, well, there's a problem with your certification. Well, but what? I mean, there could be, many different kinds of issues with the certification. And then on the clinical side, just not reasonable and necessary. Well, anybody who's been through an audit, a real post-pay audit, even the initial auditors are providing some information about their review of the record, and it's either the patient was chronic, not terminal, or there's some data about some clinical data that they're basing their opinion on. Here you have nothing to go with, and you're probably not going to get something to go to react to until you get a redetermination decision, which is like your third opportunity at advocacy, and really the first one where you're going into it with eyes wide open and knowing what you're up against. So yeah, that is a challenge, and you kind of have to deal with it by trying to take on as many issues as you can or can reasonably predict are at the heart of the denial reason.
Yeah. More bad news, Brian. You're just like a bad news, walk in the room and just wafts off you.
Yes.
Everyone hides.
The cooler, isn't that somebody that walks through the casinos and gives everybody bad luck or something? I thought there's a movie about that. So
I don't know. I don't know, but you would know because you're what do you call people into film?
A movie buff?
No. There's a fancy word for it.
Cinephile.
Cinephile, yeah.
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm a cinephile.
But yeah, you're on whatever Roger Ebert's favorite movies, 100 best movies. What are you on?
It's a chronological. I'm trying to run through his 5-star reviews. I'm up to 1968. So
all right,
Battle of Algiers is my next movie, and I had to slog through a lot of silent films to get there. So at least I'm in color now. So that's
exactly.
good.
Well, I think everyone probably can see themselves in what we just talked about. But I think that the wrinkle is, don't just sit on your hands. I think there are things you can do in terms of advocacy. And I think quick appeals are important, and, reaching out to us, because we can, help you sort of figure out, do you have a case for not moving to another round, and how to go about doing that. So anyway, until next time, Brian.
Right. Thanks a lot, Meg.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.